So, Jamie Bristow, the Mindfulness Initiative. So, this is about policy research on how mindfulness training can influence international responses to the environmental crisis through generating a shift from an atomistic to a holistic perspective. Jamie, lovely to meet you, and thanks very much for coming on today to tell us about this.
Yes, lovely to meet you too, Robin, and really good to see so many of you here today. A pleasure to be able to share our work, and the least we could do really with the gratitude that we have for the Emergence Foundation making this work possible. So I'd like to show some slides. Good, they're coming up. Here we go. So yeah, first slide, please. As I'm going to tell you a bit of background about our organisation. Sorry, next slide, please. A bit of background about our organisation, then I'll sort of focus in on the project in question. So it all begins in 2013, when the British Parliament started receiving, or MPs and members of the House of Lords started receiving mindfulness classes. And since then, 300 or so politicians have been on an 8-week mindfulness course. And after about 18 months or so, after that first few programs, getting on for 10 years ago now, the politicians started to become interested in the science behind what they'd learned and the benefits they started to feel in their own lives. And it's quite common when you get that positive experience, you want to share it with others. So their minds went to how they could share it. And that is, of course, through public policy and public services. I was one of the volunteers and experts who came together to help the politicians to create the all-party parliamentary group on mindfulness. And since then, early 2014, I've been supporting them to run policy inquiries, looking at how mindfulness could be applied in different areas of public life. And this culminated in the world's first public policy report about mindfulness training. Next slide, please. Called the Mindful Nation UK, and this is available along with all of the other work that we do for free on our website at themindfulnessinitiative.org. And this report pulled together the evidence, the sort of scientific evidence. We're now up to about 8,000 academic papers on mindfulness, with the state of the implementation, the innovation in the space, matching that to public policy concerns. And we particularly looked at health, education, criminal justice, and the workplace. And so back then it was really quite sort of targeted to where the evidence base was strongest. For instance, tackling recurrent depression or chronic pain, and in schools looking at well-being and mental health. Over time, we and the politicians that we work with became interested in what kind of was underlying these often quite kind of disparate applications of mindfulness. So sometimes it's kind of used as a reason to dismiss mindfulness as something that's being applied as a panacea, just because there are so many different applications in different areas of life. But that's kind of missing this perhaps more foundational thing that mindfulness, as a normal, natural human capacity that can be cultivated, is bringing to our lives. And so over the last few years, particularly, we have worked with politicians and other sort of decision makers, thought leaders, to look at a framework for understanding how mindfulness might be core to meeting the challenges of our times. And we published at the end of last year a document called Mindfulness Developing Agency in Urgent Times, really focusing on how mindfulness can underpin intentional action, not just in a siloed application, but more broadly in a kind of like population level. And so one of the kind of challenges that we're facing, perhaps the greatest challenge that we face, is of course the climate crisis. And so the next sort of natural step is to go from the kind of thinking work that we've been doing to looking at, okay, let's look at public policy now. What can we say about mindfulness and how it could help us to increase responsiveness and resilience to the climate crisis? And it just so happens actually that the evidence has progressed in this area around sustainability and pro-environmental behavior enough where we can actually create, we feel, a review of that evidence with some recommendations for government and other national and international institutions. Building on this work around agency that we've been doing over the last few years. And so that's where the Emergence Foundation have come in and helped us to conduct research where we have we've been working with a Professor Christine Wamsler of the Lund University Center for Sustainability Studies. Oh, I should mention actually, when I say we, the Mindfulness Initiative is like a think tank. We're now an education charity and policy institute, which supports the all-party parliamentary group on mindfulness, but is different from it. So the Mindfulness Initiative has been working with Lund University to review the research in the area, to survey the kind of innovation in the space, like you've heard from Paula today, doing some really valuable innovation work, taking mindfulness training and applying it to new outcomes, really targeting particular kind of social outcomes. We've looked at the kind of innovation that's particularly relevant to sustainability. And we're also conducting a very wide consultation of academics, innovators and policymakers in order to both kind of like find innovations that we haven't seen before, but also to understand the policy context and how people are currently thinking about it, what language they're using, how they see the inner dimension of the climate crisis, or at all, if at all. And that's one of the main sort of findings, as we somewhat expected, that actually mainstream policy thinking is only just cottoning on really to the really fundamental aspect of the inner dimension being a fundamental aspect of what's going on, both in terms of the problem and in terms of what we can do about it. And we also have spoken to 15 leading experts. Caroline Lucas, being a vice chair of the all-party group on mindfulness, was obviously very keen to take part, as well as directors from global NGOs, thought leaders, writers, and people from in the civil service, nationally and sort of transnationally. And so, like we have in the past, after Mindful Nation UK, we've created a number of quite influential policy reports and publications. We're going to pull these three aspects together once again: the research, the innovation in the space, and how it's currently considered by policymakers. Like, what's the right language to be using to match it to their thinking, so we can make the case for using mindfulness to increase responsiveness. And we're going to publish a report later this year. And hopefully we've applied to be present at the COP conference in November, if it goes ahead face to face, and this kind of thing is possible, where we'll try and engage policymakers in with our work. And this is the beginning of a process. Once you create a report like this, you can't just assume that everyone who should read it will read it. And so we'll spend the next couple of years or so engaging people with it, but hopefully giving it a good launch later on in the year. And if you're interested in this project, there's a bit of a write-up about it. I will drop a link in the chat. And again, have a browse of all of our other documents there, which are free to download, or you can buy them inexpensively in print online. Okay, thanks again for listening today. And once again, deep gratitude for making this important work possible to the Emergence Foundation.
It's a pleasure, Jamie. Yeah, great. What an incredible project. It was a second climate change project, but seriously different angle to the Cumbria, from grassroots to kind of top down. Can I ask, how many people are involved directly with your project, and how much of a network of people are there around the world working in the kind of way that you're working?
So on this project specifically, we have 4 people. So myself and the professor and then we have research assistant and more senior researcher working at present. In
Okay.
terms of we've discovered a lot of work going on, and we have one of the things that we're hoping to contribute is a kind of map of everything that's going on with a table
Right.
of programs in the appendix, and that itself is going to be valuable. Most of it is pretty early stage, as in people have done a few pilots, they're doing some research. There's one really promising example actually being partly funded by the European Commission, called the Climate Leaders Program, or in other terms, the Inner Green Deal. And so, yeah, I'd say maybe something like 20 to 30 programs that we're aware of that are directly looking at bringing contemplative
Right.
practice and inner capacity development to sustainability.
Well, it's a whole happening that I'm personally completely unaware of it before now. Really interesting. And as you say, it's very early days maybe with this, but where do you think the biggest inroads are being made?
Well, again, the European Commission is doing some very innovative stuff, and as part of that, they've put out a call for bids rather, that includes for the first time wanting to hear from inner development, inner capacity building programs, and the real leverage point is around mindsets. So this is like, one example of the difference could be, are human beings at the top of a pyramid in dominion over the rest of the earth, and over
Hmm.
other people who don't look like us, perhaps, or are we enmeshed in the harmonic web of life where everything has a kind of interaction because everything's interconnected? Now that kind of mindset shift, it looks like, is facilitated by mindfulness, and particularly mindfulness in coordination with nature connection,
Oh,
and
interesting.
so getting getting people into nature with a mindful element at scale, funded hopefully, but not by themselves but by government through our policy report and our recommendations, would be a realistic 3-year sort of pilot anyway aim.
Mm. Sounds like forest bathing, the Japanese pursuit of
Yeah, very
actually
much.
sort of meditation in nature. Right, look, there's lots of questions rolling in here. What have you found does galvanize people's passion to change?
Well, there's a really, really big question there. Wow. Um, I mean, the element that mindfulness can bring, perhaps I'll sort of focus on that, because many different areas I could approach that question from. For myself, I went from working in advertising and being a black knight of consumerism to working in a climate change campaign, and I credit my mindfulness practice for that. And the
Right.
reason I wanted to change, I heard the same stats I'd heard many times before, but I had a greater level of sensitivity and openness to challenging information. And that's one of the, mindfulness isn't just attention training, it's got particular qualities. And that's openness, curiosity, and care. That's what makes it mindfulness rather than some other form of awareness. And it's that openness to challenging or novel information that we might have otherwise shut down and not wanted to hear, that could be critical to changing views and changing behavior.
Interesting. Okay, great work you're doing, Jamie. Historically, mindfulness has a spiritual background. Does this figure in your work, and how do practitioners such as MPs relate to it?
Well, the tone in Parliament over the last 7 years has become very spiritual. I mean, there's a regular sitting group every 5:30, at least it was until recently, on Tuesdays, and the group of committed practitioners, maybe sort of particularly 30 to 40 or so, who keep coming back in a particular group, cross-party. It really is a touching, and bringing more of themselves into politics and finding different ways of relating cross-party ways. And I'd say there's a spiritual element to that for sure. The
Mm.
question about, to what extent is mindfulness a psychological capacity, which is natural and, we were kind of born with it, or is it a training program which has its roots in spiritual traditions? That's around sort of language and definitions. I think there is definitely an inquiry within the mindfulness sector going on about how much is it okay to make explicit that a kind of a spiritual component, an ethical component, how much should that be implicit and embodied by the teachers? Because particularly if you're going into schools, that you have a kind of you have a responsibility to sort of check what kind of frameworks you're bringing in,
Absolutely.
and you don't want to trigger a kind of immune response from the powers that be.
Fair enough. Yeah. Okay. Are you happy with the extent of the impact the project's having on the kind of polarization evident in the political sphere?
Well, there is some nascent scientific evidence that mindfulness reduces polarization. I'm aware of some that's pre-publication that's going to be really exciting when it comes out. So that's sort of academically, and there is a lot of anecdotal accounts from politicians who say that mindfulness helps us to disagree better, and the three things that they most mention is it helps us to respond, not react. So respond creatively rather than blindly out of habit or impulse. It helps them to have respect for other people who have differing views. They say they can see how they got to that position, even if they still don't agree with it, because they're connecting at their kind of level of shared humanity and sort of see, well, they see where they're coming from. And the other one is perspective taking, more broadly. And these things, keeping things in perspective and seeing things from different perspectives, and these three things seem to lead to a better relationships and a more considered approach to exchanges of differing views.
Sounds like what we could do within politics to me. Could you give us an example of the impact on specific political groups or individuals?
Yeah, I mean, there are a few politicians when they first went on the course back in 2013, 14, they'd say, "Look, I'll come along, just don't tell anybody." Like it was a risky thing, because who knows how it would be perceived by the Daily Mail. But increasingly, they want to talk about it whenever they can, and one or two have talked about their own personal journeys. One particularly, the real leader of this in Parliament was Chris Ruan, who was described in the press as a knuckle-dragging bruiser and one of the worst hecklers in Parliament. His colleagues said he was disruptive, to almost like a value to him. And now he's sort of completely the opposite and really thinks that things should be done differently, and says and credits mindfulness to that entirely. And then on the other side of the House, politicians have also said, yes, it's made me, real strong Brexiteers still, really believing in Brexit, but noticeably different, and in the chamber saying, let's calm down, actually making an intervention in the House of Commons, trying to take the kind of heat out of when it's getting unskillful.
Amazing. Well, the mention of the Daily Mail there, that somebody does actually comment, it'd be good for mindfulness to work to morph into journalism too.
And that's the main thing keeping this back, I have to say. Like when there was news recently that the House of Commons did another RFP, a request for bids to provide mindfulness training, and the Daily Mail is like, why are we spending money on our politicians? They just don't. Then there isn't sort of an understanding that we need to cultivate the better angels of our nature, particularly amongst leaders. And so yeah, the fear of the Daily Mail is one of the greatest checks on progress in.
Interesting. I don't think it's only there. Lots of walks of life. That's true. Right, we're out of time, Jamie. Thank you very much. Another fascinating project, really different again. And I can see by the engagement that everybody's really appreciated. So thanks very much for coming on.
Bye.